Hi, this is Robert Trieren with CG Cookie, and today we'll be going over the process for doing a vehicle concept. I'm going to start by doing a quick breakdown of my process and technique. That way you'll have a better idea of what I'm doing when I'm doing things in a faster time-lapse manner. So we're working in Photoshop, well I am, and I'm going to go over my basic process here for you. And let's see, not using anything too fancy as far as brushes or anything, just the default hard round. And to start with, at least I do, is save time and so forth, I have other dynamics off, shape dynamics are on to pin pressure, and roundness to pin pressure, and smoothing is on. Helps a little bit, you don't want your paintbrush being too jagged. Okay, so right now, paintbrush does this. No fading in between each stroke or anything like that. And the advantage to this is when you're doing your initial layout, your colors don't get muddy at all. So up here we have a picture, it's actually a picture of my car. I'll be using it as an example of how I bring in colors and sample things from reference. And using the eyedropper tool, I go in and grab what would be the top facet, fill it in, and then what would be the side facet. Yep, missed a bit. And then what would be the front facet. And this is the same process I use for when doing concepts on vehicles, characters, environments. You basically want your initial illustration to look like a low poly model. Get this out of the way. Now, obviously this does not look like a vehicle, but the same process can be used for it. So let's say the hood, the top, and the sides. That on the wrong layer. The hood, the top, and the sides. Can be illustrated in the same manner. And of course you can do this to something that is at a different angle as well. You're just using it as a reference point for the palette. Because obviously unless you yourself are emitting a light source, as you walk around an object, the lighting is going to stay the same on the object, the angle just changes. So obviously this is not perfect perspective wise or anything, it's a quick example. So this can be used to create up complex shapes, and realistically a lot of when it comes down to illustrating and doing concept art, it's all about breaking things down into the simplest shapes possible and making you not have to guess as much as possible, because that's when you start to tire yourself and things become overly complicated. So here we have a cube in a slightly more complex shape that are done in the same manner and use the same color as our reference here. Now, this can be done to create a vehicle that is angled differently. Let's grab a top color. Be careful, there's some reflection going on here, so you might grab the wrong color if you're not careful. But you can also grab off the cubes or the other illustration we got going on here. And I'm just outlining and then paint bucketing in the last bit to save time. You can use a larger brush if you feel like it, but I use a smaller brush initially anyway. Paint bucket it in, smooth it out, and then grabbing this color. So as you can see, we've got a representation of the two different materials here. We got on the same or near the same plane, we have the painted surface and the windshield reflecting. Probably grab it slightly. Oh, no, that's correct. Add in another window here. So as long as your reference has the materials or something close to what you're trying to accomplish, you can get accurate colors. And of course, this is best done with photographic reference, etc. You don't want to be doing this off of a illustration or a low-end 3D rendering. A high-end one that's done properly takes into account all kinds of stuff like bounce lighting, etc. Those you can actually do, and if you're a wizard at 3D, you can actually sit there and render out a little sample, let's say a sample cube or a sample sphere, and then of the materials that'll be in your scene, and then eyedrop off of them. And so now we have two vehicles of the same color in the same painted as if they're in the same space, but at different angles, but from the same reference. As you can see, these two vehicles, if you had an illustration with both of them in it, could share the same space and would look accurate, along with this cube here, which is the wrong layer. There we go. So this is how I use photographic reference and anything else I'm working with to produce, or at least do the initial layout of a piece. And it can be used on non-vehicles, obviously, as we have a cube here, which could be an abstract of a structure. But you could use this to create a larger environment, and even the things in the foreground and background of this picture could be used. For example, the asphalt can be used to produce groundwork, and also the shadows cast from the vehicles. The vehicle in the picture can be used on the vehicles themselves in the scene, as well as being used as references to a lighting angle and so forth. And this is something that you want to be able to do and understand why you're doing it at the same time. It's a shortcut, but not really something you can do if you don't understand light source. Your color theories are very important, because you want to know why you're doing these shortcuts. But this is something you eventually move on to doing to save yourself time and headache while producing more complex pieces. As you can see here, we have a small layout doing this of two vehicles sharing the same space and lighting. We have similar materials. And no crazy headache inducing process was used, just using the eyedropper tool and knowledge of theory and lighting and so forth. Back in here. There we go. So this is my basic process for doing step 1 of my layout. Step 2 involves overlaying textures and photographic elements to help build up detail. Obviously, I would bring in a little bit more painting detail when I was actually doing a piece. For example, I might add in, as this has a multifaceted, it's not flat in real life, so it's multifaceted. I got a lower section that's darker and a section that's reflecting the ground a bit, and a section that's reflecting the sky. And this, I would go through and illustrate this out as much as possible off of my reference, filling in all the details and stuff. You want to get this as real looking as possible while still using a hard brush if you're following my process. You can use your own as well, but this is what I'm going to be using in the later videos, so this will help you know at least what I'm doing. And now that we've got something that has some facets to it, I'll go through and clean it up just a touch before I bring in some textures. And usually my reference is in a window outside of my work area, but I have it in here for easy demonstration this time around. Let's put in some wheel arches. Get our rubber in here for a tire. And the hubcaps, or the rims in this case, and the initial shadow underneath it. Now that we've got a image going on here with a little bit more complexity with the facets and so forth on the surface we'll be working with anyway. Got our little low poly looking vehicle. I'm going to start bringing in textures from my reference image here. And let's see. As far as settings, you don't have to really worry about this much. You just kind of use whatever they work. In Photoshop, you can literally use the arrow keys to cycle through all the layer types. When taking textures off a reference, you want to do it in facets. So if you're grabbing the tire, you would want to grab just this front face, not the whole thing, because the whole thing's not on the same orientation. You want to grab flat as possible textures off of your reference. So, such as this panel right here, I'll cut it off right there, bring it up and around. This will be a touch skewed just because the image is off, but it can be touched up later. Okay, so we've got our cut image. Bring the opacity down on that a bit and line it up. I'm using the perspective tool here, which I have hotkeyed. If you're using something other than Photoshop and you don't have a perspective tool, you can kind of do it with just skewing it and scaling it. Usually they have other stuff that kind of works but just isn't called the same thing. But yeah, get our thing going where we want it to fit. Okay, it fits a bit. Of course, this is still on a normal, so you pull it up and it goes to automatically that. So put it on normal and cycle through the various types of overlay layers, or layer types. Overlay is its own thing, until we find something that matches. It's my experience that different lighting situations use different types of overlays. So soft light works pretty well here, but it's a little bit too dull. Overlay is working pretty well. Overlay is generally a pretty good one overall. These other ones are kind of washing it out too much. Multiply worked pretty well. Then we got normal, of course. So I set it to overlay. And one thing I wanted to go over, if you're using, oh, disappeared, set that back to normal. If you're using a image that is a, let's say you're painting a red car, but your reference is yellow. Obviously, if you overlaid a yellow over red, it would affect it. So what you can do is set your saturation to 0. So now your overlay is grayscale. Set it back to overlay, bring it back down. Now it is no longer adding any color to it. It's only using what's painted and only using the solid colors laid down earlier. Now levels on an overlay, especially if it's grayscale, I'll try to bring this in to where you can see both of these at the same time. Okay. Since it's overlaying in a grayscale and even with color as well, but you can sit here, mess with the levels, darker and lighter, as well as the overall opacity to get your proper desired effect. You can hit auto as well. It doesn't always work, but it can be a quick fix, make things look a little bit nicer. Okay, now that we've got an overlay going on, it's almost working as a bit of a guide over our initial image because we use such a large swath. I'm going to go in and change out these wheel arches, scale them up a bit, because obviously the initial wheels weren't quite to scale. Fill that out. Okay, get these drawn in again. Okay, and now we're going to bring in the wheels as a texture. And this time I'm going to grab more than what I need so I can illustrate how to trim them down. Get them overlaid where I want them. Okay. Wheels aren't quite big enough. That'll work. Okay, so we've got our wheel, and this time I'm going to use a masking layer, which is a standard feature in Photoshop, and unmask it only where I want the wheel to actually be, because my sample was a bit oversized. Get that all in there. This is my masking layer. As you can see, bring in a little bit more of that, clean that up. So with the masking layer, white is on, black is off. So everything that was painted black in that image is off. It isn't being shown. Now I'm going to set it to, I'm going to run through the gambit of overlay types. The pin light works pretty well here. Hard light's looking pretty good. Okay, I'm going to set it to hard light for now. For the sake of time, I'm going to just multiply that over, or reproduce it over. And reuse the front wheel and the rear. Okay. And now my third process, I'm going to change my brush setting, which was initially the hard setting without the other dynamics on, turn that on. So you can see I just have opacity and flow set to pin pressure with 0 jitter, so I can get a nice clean stroke. And then I zoom in, and as you can see, all these jagged edges and rough bits that have been left from the overlays. Sometimes adds to an image. You get a bit of extra texture and roughness that otherwise wasn't there, and you would have had to have painted in over a long period of time. Using a small brush relative to my image, I can go in and sample these colors, which, since we've been laying them down in solids, aren't foggy or muddy at all. Just make sure to only sample lightly and then go through and cut them in, following the contours and correcting bits. I mean, obviously this needs to be cut out as a wheel arch right here, so cut that out. And again, be very careful not to sample off of things you've already painted over, because your colors will end up muddy, and that can be a long road of ruining your picture stroke by stroke and then having to go through and readjust it or repaint the thing altogether because it came out muddy in the first place. Clean up this fender. Cut this off here. By using this process, you can produce in a time-effective manner any type of hard surface object. It can work with characters as far as like clothing, especially if you're doing a sci-fi character wearing hard surface clothing such as reactive armor or whatever else works for your project at the moment. And I know that some people are purists and don't like using photographic elements. You don't have to, but they really do help speed things along. It's just a matter of how much do you want to cover it up afterwards and clean it up. In the composition stages, I've used nothing but photographic elements before, just overlaying them on each other at different opacities until I had an image that started to look like what I was going for, and then I started to paint over it. Clean up this rear view mirror. Okay, so now we've got a quick and rough illustration of my process, and I will bring in a texture of something unrelated in a second to illustrate how anything really works with this. Of course, it has to do with how well you can match the elements. So now we're starting to get something that looks like a car here. And I'm going to bring in a cropped version of the sci-fi tank from later on, and to illustrate how things don't have to obviously be a one-to-one recreation to be compatible with one another. I'll sit here and trim off a top bit. Using perspective tool and so forth, I'm going to match it as much as possible anyway. And one thing to remember with perspective tools, every time you turn it off, it defaults back to a square. So if you're working a crazy angle or you got to fix it, it takes a few steps sometimes to get it to match or get it to be close. Okay, so because this is obviously yellow and it's not matching, I'm going to set it to I'm going to desaturate it, set it aside, and duplicate it. Something like that. Run through, see what works for this particular image. overlay seems to be working pretty well. Play with the levels and see if I can get a better match. Try a soft light. Okay, and then using a masking layer, I'm going to bring it up, turn it off, and then bring it back in where I want it. And obviously, since the hood is a facet and the windshield is a different facet, it's best to bring them in different parts. But I've already got a bit of a hinge going on here, and for time's sake, I think the illustration still works. And I can adjust it along that facet a bit. Oops. So as you can see, we're starting to get something that looks almost Mad Max-esque, because we have a armored hood and a reinforced windshield with a bit of a siding that it doesn't quite match, but it goes to show that you can use almost anything. They don't have to be a one-to-one recreation. And I shall go over this a little bit, true it up. See if I can get it. And obviously this is why you want to do multiple passes with your hard brush when doing the initial layout. As you can see here, it's looking a bit abstract because it only had one shade, when in reality the actual image had multiple dips and bends to it, which since they were not reproduced, it comes out looking a bit odd. So that's why you always want to go through and do as many passes with a hard brush as possible before you overlay anything over it, because otherwise you have to go back through and do a lot more work to make this match later on. Anyway, that should be a quick example of my process. I shall be using this exact process on the upcoming concept where I show producing this. So in step one, obviously there's a bit of silhouette and sketch work usually involved, unless I know exactly what I'm going to produce like I did here. I just use, for sketch work, it's just multiply black and white. Nothing too crazy going on there. And then the hard colors put in like as we saw here, and then the texture overlay, and then the cleanup work done in close with the brush settings with the other dynamics turned on. Okay, and now we'll get into the larger portion showing the concept production of this piece right here. Okay, for starters, we're going to work with the multiply layer in a black paintbrush, building up a silhouette based on the reference. One thing you do is once you block out a overall silhouette is you can start a layer on top of it and take that original layer and lower it down to be more of a gray, so you can continue to add layers on top of the original, which add more detail without having to destroy your original silhouette. As you can see here, it's very quick and blocky. It doesn't have to be very detailed. This is a thumbnail. Now I got it more or less where I want it. I'll move it off to the side and do a more detailed version with a slightly more exact perspective. One thing, a trick that I always use, or just kind of a rule of thumb, is it's better to start over with a sketch than it is to sit there and try to fix it. As you can see here, instead of trying to take that thumbnail and make it somehow match what I'm looking for, it's easier to set it aside and start a new one. And now I'm bringing in colors like I demonstrated before from reference image, the facets and so forth. Angles different. I'm going with a slightly desert theme because it matches the theme of the vehicle I'm going to go for. We're going to just block it in like it's a low poly model. It doesn't have to be perfect, just as long as you sample from the correct areas, you should be able to get something that looks about right. And then using the perspective tool, and by grabbing elements I can move them around and adjust them and correct things. And here I'm blocking in, starting to add in other elements that aren't in my reference. Well, they are, but they are from other elements other than the source vehicle, the main one. And one main thing to do or keep in mind is when you're adding silhouettes on an already colored piece, you want to silhouette with the darkest color, or kind of a mid-tone near the darker end of it from your reference. If you end up using black, you'll have to go through and cover up every little bit of the silhouette that was in black. I did this later and you'll see what I mean. I'll make sure to call it out for you. Here we're blocking out the turret elements. As you can see here, I go back and forth just a little bit. There's nothing wrong when doing this, just make sure you don't spend too much time detailing it, and that's why I use a very rough and quick approach to my work, especially early on. That way I can go back and forth without having wasted a whole bunch of time and effort. As mentioned before, I'm using a hard brush, that way I can cut small details and block in large details time effectively without doing any damage to my color, as in blending it over and making it muddy. This is really good for rapid prototyping as seen here, and also layout work. As I'm adjusting, painting over, scaling, repositioning stuff, if I had been using a softer brush it would have gotten muddy by now and I might have had some poor colors going on. But by using the harder colors I can cut and remove and reposition stuff without having any real issues. Again, if you don't have a perspective tool in your program of choice, you can usually get by with scaling and skewing. I think almost every program has a scale and skew feature to some degree. It may not be quite as pretty as Photoshop's, but you can get by, and with a hasty paint over you can make it look like it was meant to be wherever you reposition it. Now we've pretty much got a blocked in a three-dimensional painting here that looks like a low poly model, which is what we want. Now we're going to move it to the side, and I'm going to start working on the rear. As you can see, I took it over and made everything black using the levels. It's just a simple level adjustment. And as it's viewed from the rear, certain elements, the major elements, are going to be exactly the same. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you do this, technically you'd be seeing the underside of the vehicle. Same thing if you did this with a character, you'd be seeing like the underside of their shoes if they were at a slight angle. So you have to adjust things. The upper section is going to be accurate, the lower section has to be tweaked. But as this is a large vehicle, it's not too big of a deal. The upper section was the biggest part that had to be matched. And also, as you can see, there's a lot of black going on. That was because I brought it over as a silhouette, which I mentioned earlier is something you don't want to do when adding something to a vehicle or to a concept in general, because all this black in the tires and the turret, also in the antenna cage over the top, has to be covered by another non-black color before it actually matches the overall painting. Which, if you watch this, you'll see there's black on this for a long time, and it took me a good amount of effort to cover this up later. So save yourself some time and headache, and always make sure to bring it in as a mid-tone from your reference image, or a darker, or even the background lighting color. Let's say if you got a blue background, so you're near an ocean scene or what have you, whatever your reflected light is, you can also use that as your silhouette color. That works pretty well too. And now that, since it's in the same scene as before with the demos, we can even sample off the other tank which is already drawn and use it as a palette reference. Of course, we can see inside the turret and so forth that's exposed from the rear. So some details need to be added in areas you couldn't see from the other view, which is why you do these front and rear 3/4. And see here, I'm having to clean up a lot of the black that I had left in here with the silhouette. Okay, now that we've got those squared away, I'm start bringing in photographic elements from my reference, matching them up with what I had painted. Adjusting the levels and saturation to make sure they fit in very well. Here we're adjusting a panel to make it work in perspective as it's a slight angle, which gave it a nice sectioned look, which came in handy later. Underside details and so forth. Slightly more extreme angle, but it still manages to fit in there. You can fit things to almost any angle using this technique. Also, since I'm bringing it in per angle, it's giving it a very faceted look, which adds to the whole sci-fi feel of it, such as anything you see from especially really early, such as 70s, maybe even late 60s sci-fis. They have very sectioned sci-fi vehicles in them, and spacecraft and so forth, made out of modular panels. So if you want something to look sci-fi and you start making it look modular, it helps. Here we have a panel that we use as reference, and it helps to also true up the details as the wheel arches, which is a touch off. That's one less thing you have to paint and get perfect without having a one-to-one reference. Also, especially with that back wheel panel, you can see I only brought in a small section to overlay it. You don't have to cover every piece of your painting with texture to make it look right. If you can have the edges of it, a little bit of it, if you don't have a reference that fits perfectly, you can trim around it and bring in smaller elements, things that would otherwise be mismatched due to angles or what have you. You can bring in smaller bits and use them as well, and then mesh them together. Things again, bringing in much smaller elements on the turret section here. And none of these elements were off of a turret either, so these are all being repurposed 100%. And most of them are built up out of small pieces as I'm bashing them together, because I'm not quite sure while painting this exactly what I want this the turret to look like as far as its cannon and so forth. Also remember, you can use a masking layer to clean up and remove some of the excess stuff of your reference being brought in. One thing to keep in mind, as things go further in the distance, they're going to fade away into whatever your background color is. If it's not an image, it's going to be whatever your solid is. So let's say the 3 wheels or the 4 wheels, the further back they go, the lower the opacity should be set on your texture overlay. So it's less and less detail as it goes further back. Maybe like I think a 5% difference will usually work. Adding in the panel work, matching it to the front view as well as the rear view. You have to make sure these things match. They don't have to be 100% perfect like it was a modeling sheet, but you want it to be as close as possible, as an artist later on, or you, might have to produce a modeling sheet based off of this, so you want to try to keep things accurate from one view to the other, especially if it's something you can see in both views. It's one thing to keep in mind too when doing, say, characters or doing asymmetrical vehicles, is you want to make sure you don't mix up your left and your right elements. Otherwise you can have a character looking like they're left-handed in one view and right-handed in another, and that can really throw off production, especially if it's a very small project with a very tight deadline. Something might go through and it's backwards. So always make sure to keep things relative to where they should be when working on the front and rear views. There's a good example of me bringing in smaller elements and using it twice to actually build up a front and a back side to it. So it's a double-sided tow hitch on the rear, as well as some exhaust here. Some minor rescaling going on. I'm bringing in panels for the other side of the wheel arch. Now we're just filling in the details for the textures on the other sides of the wheels. So before, you want to make them fade a little bit as they go out further from the viewer. Adding in the panels. And much of this is the same detail as seen on the other side, just at a slightly different angle as viewed from the rear. So speed this up just a little bit. If this was a asymmetrical vehicle, this side would be unique from the other in some more important aspects than it is in this instance. And now we're working on the turret here. As you can see, I'm cutting it off, and I'm actually using elements of the turret painting that's in the scene to overlay over it, and bringing in some details into the interior of the turret here. Again, these are repurposed. This was not the inside of a turret initially. And bring in the small cannon, but doubling it up as a mammoth style turret with twin barrels. And as it's sci-fi, we want to go through and give it a bit of a treatment, adding in some little implied energy packs and so forth to the edge of it. And as we've added it to one side, add it to the other, and since it's a cylinder, it's easy enough to flip around and just change the angle of the contour. And just adjusting the levels on the barrels to get it the color I was looking for. Okay, let's see, got this leveled out where I want it. Sometimes when you level a scene out, it will go through and make the background a color to match the colored object in the middle. Overlaying some textures to add some grit and dirt over the detail, which can really be the selling point of a piece like this. It can imply rust and so forth. And now going in with a softer set brush, still 100% opacity, but with it set to where it fades in between brush strokes. Going in and cutting the details in between the different objects that make up our vehicle here in the turret. As our background is now a slight blue color that's being used as reflection on the contours of the barrels to make them pop more. And some angular cuts are being put in to make it read more of as a sci-fi style weapon. Also, one thing to keep in mind when doing this, since you've already got all this overlaid stuff, textures, and painting to go, you don't want to use your small brush and end up painting over all of it. You want to use it around the perimeter of your details to cut the contours in where you need them, leaving most of the texture work and painting work you've already done intact, as much as possible anyway. Otherwise you'll have to go through and at the very least add in another texture on top of it to kind of add the grit back into it, and some of the details if you take it too far in that direction as well. And also, since we've been using the process of using a hard brush that has the proper colors sampled from our reference, all the colors should be relatively balanced with one another, so you can eyedrop off of your image at this point. Just do not eyedrop off of things you've painted over. Always make sure not to eyedrop over areas you've painted, which the areas you've painted should be a very minimal area as you're making effort to cut details in instead of painting over the entire thing. And this should it helps to where you don't have to think too hard when you're dealing with color theory, which when you're working on a piece 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 6 days a week, 7 days a week in some cases, it helps. Any shortcuts that you can do that don't bring down the quality but make it to where you can work on something longer without straining yourself mentally is a major plus. And the more hours you can paint on something, the more time you get in practice-wise per piece and more productive you are. And while this process may not appeal to you or work for you, every artist has their own process eventually. So what I'd suggest is following this process if you don't have one already, see if it works for you, and then tweak it here and there as you go along. I mean, my own process is based off of things I learned from other artists years back, some of which you didn't even paint in color. Now, as you can see here, this the front section is really muddy from all the overlays, so this is a spot where you can really go in and cut in the details. Has some tools bolted to the front and so forth, as well as some angled pieces of metal going across the front. And the markers on the corners. And while it's zoomed in here, you can see all the grit and dirt that's been added in as a texture overlay over a texture overlay over a painting. So it's that layered look that really brings a look of realism to something. And you just can't quite pull it off with just a brush, at least not in a time-effective manner. As you can see, keeping your painting to a minimal around the edges of something, you can actually block it in the rest of the way, and even zoomed in, it's hard to tell what's painted and what isn't because the painting is so minimalistic around the edges. And duplicating the lights from one side to the other to save on time, because there's no need to redraw something twice. And some artists are purists and want to draw or paint everything that's in an image no matter what. And yeah, it's good to do while you're studying or while you're practicing, because every time you draw it is another practice, but you also wear yourself down quicker that way too. So the idea is not so much painting less per piece, it's making it to where you can paint more throughout a day. So instead of painting one vehicle concept, let's say using purist techniques, only using painting, you could produce 2 of them or perhaps 3 of them in a day, and without wearing yourself down. And they may even come out nicer because you've got some texture overlay. It makes them look more photorealistic if that's what you're going for. Here we're doing some final detailing in on the antenna cage that goes over the top. Something like this, that's a bunch of concurrent lines. You want to make sure that you have your perspective at least close. Obviously, with something like this, you're going to want to already know your fundamentals of perspective. Here you can see I'm finally going through and blocking in and cutting out the black which was left over. It's still there, so always make sure to use the mid-tone whenever possible. It's not till I'm getting it this detailed in that the black disappears. And with some pieces you don't get the chance to go through and detail it. Let's say you're supposed to be seeing rough pieces. Well, they're not going to look as good no matter what if you have a bunch of black all over the place. Or if you're working on a piece and your production gets cut off and you have to turn it in early, it's not going to look as good. And it saves time just doing it properly the first time too. Here we're detailing out the exhaust in the rear of the vehicle, insides of the tires. So you can notice the tires that are further up are just silhouettes. You don't have to go through and detail them out all the way anyway. Just having the first one detailed well enough and implied, it works for the rest of them, as they're obviously repeated on the other side and on the right side of the vehicle, even in the same view. And here we have it finalized, cropped out and presented on a black background for good contrast. Go over the process. Again, we went through and painted it using the hard brush, the 100% opacity with no extra effects for blending and so forth, so we get a nice low poly looking vehicle. And then adding in textures, we got the roughed in image, and then with the close-up painting we were able to clean it up and then crop it for presentation. This has been a tutorial on vehicle concepts and related techniques. Thanks for watching.